Tanzania, once hailed as one of East Africa's most stable democracies, has in recent months descended into turmoil. What began as a year of political tension and cautious optimism has spiraled into chaos on the streets of Dar es Salaam, Arusha, and Dodoma. The October 2025 general election, intended to reaffirm the country's democratic credentials, instead became the flashpoint for unrest, exposing deep divisions that have been building for years. The roots of the crisis trace back months before Tanzanians cast their votes. In February and March 2025, the government under President Samia Suluhu Hassan celebrated a national triumph, the end of the deadly Marburg virus outbreak, hailed by the World Health Organization as a public health victory. It was a brief moment of pride for a country eager to move forward after years of struggle. In May, the government announced a new foreign policy direction, one focused on economic diplomacy, the diaspora, and expanding the maritime economy, a move that suggested Tanzania was positioning itself as a regional powerhouse. But beneath the optimism, tensions simmered. By April, cracks had begun to show in the political order. Tundu Lissu, the outspoken opposition leader of Chadema, was arrested and charged with treason after demanding electoral reforms at a public rally. The arrest sent shockwaves through the nation and revived fears of political repression reminiscent of the Magufuli era. Soon after, Chadema was barred from fully participating in the election, and its candidates were sidelined under technical pretexts. Human rights groups warned of a deepening crackdown, journalists were harassed, activists abducted near border regions, and the Electoral Commission's independence was increasingly questioned. As the months unfolded, the democratic space tightened further. In June, Parliament was dissolved in preparation for the elections, and reports of torture and sexual violence against activists surfaced, painting a grim picture of what was to come. Opposition figures and their supporters faced threats and arrests, while ruling party members, backed by state machinery, dominated the public narrative. The same heavy hand that Tanzanians once associated with the late President John Pombe Magufuli now seemed to re-emerge under new leadership, though cloaked in a softer tone. Magufuli's shadow still looms large over the country. Known as the bulldozer, he ruled Tanzania from 2015 until his death in 2021, blending populist nationalism with fierce authoritarianism. He won praise for fighting corruption and championing local industry, yet his intolerance for dissent and his clampdown on freedoms scarred the nation's democratic spirit. When his vice president, Samia Suluhu Hassan, took office after his sudden death, she was widely seen as a reformer. For a time, it seemed Tanzania would turn a new page. Bans on opposition rallies were lifted, some political prisoners were freed, and journalists cautiously returned to work. But by 2025, as elections neared, many Tanzanians began to feel that the promise of openness had evaporated. In late July, the election schedule was officially set, campaigns to begin in late August, voting on October 29th. The ruling party, Chama cha Mapinduzi, CCM, which has governed uninterrupted since independence, appeared ready to extend its dominance. Yet across towns and villages, frustration brewed. Internet restrictions began quietly, with social media slowed or blocked, cutting off activists' communication lines. Opposition rallies were disrupted, while CCM candidates toured the country freely under heavy security. When Election Day arrived, the tension that had been building for months erupted. In Dar es Salaam, groups of young protesters filled the streets, chanting for change. Tear gas filled the air as police moved in, gunshots echoed through neighborhoods. Fires broke out at petrol stations and buses were torched. The government imposed a dusk-to-dawn curfew, and soon after, the entire country was plunged into an internet blackout. Overnight, Tanzania, a nation once known for its calm, was cut off from the world. Reports from human rights organizations painted a grim picture. Dozens of protesters were arrested, and several opposition leaders disappeared from public view. The government defended its actions as necessary to preserve order, but many saw it as a desperate attempt to suppress dissent. The opposition declared the election a farce, calling it a coronation rather than a contest. International observers expressed concern over the fairness of the process, while regional bodies remained largely silent. As chaos spread, the streets of Dar es Salaam grew eerily quiet. Soldiers patrolled intersections, businesses shuttered, and citizens stayed indoors, afraid of being caught in the crossfire. The ruling party was poised to claim victory, but the cost of that victory was immense. Trust in the political process had eroded, and the country's image as a stable democracy had been severely tarnished. Regionally, Tanzania's turmoil rippled beyond its borders. As one of East Africa's largest economies and home to the strategic port of Dar es Salaam, the unrest threatened trade routes and supply chains to landlocked neighbors such as Zambia, Malawi, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Investors began to worry about the security of the region, while neighboring governments watched nervously, some seeing in Tanzania's turmoil a mirror of their own fragile political systems. For ordinary Tanzanians, the impact is deeply personal. Many recall the Magufuli years, when dissent was dangerous but the streets were orderly, and now wonder whether the chaos of 2025 is the price of seeking change. Others see this moment as a reckoning, a painful but necessary struggle for the freedoms promised long ago. As the smoke clears from the October clashes, one truth stands out: Tanzania stands at a crossroads. The old authoritarian habits of the Magufuli era still cast a long shadow, but a new generation is rising, connected, restless, and unwilling to remain silent. The world watches as the nation once called the haven of peace wrestles with its identity, its democracy, and its future. In the months leading to Tanzania's 2025 general election, a quiet storm began to brew within the nation's political landscape. What was meant to be a democratic contest quickly turned into a one-sided race after the country's two main opposition figures, Tundu Lissu and Luhaga Jolson Paina, were both removed from the presidential ballot. Their exclusion set the stage for a tense and chaotic election season that would later plunge the nation into unrest. Tundu Lissu, the fiery leader of the opposition party Chadema, had long been the face of resistance against the ruling Chama cha Mapinduzi, CCM. A lawyer by training and a survivor of a 2017 assassination attempt, Lissu had spent years in exile before returning to Tanzania with renewed determination to challenge the government. His rallies attracted massive crowds, and his speeches resonated with a generation eager for reform. But the authorities viewed him as a threat. In April 2025, during a political rally calling for electoral reforms, police surrounded Lissu's gathering and arrested him on charges of treason, an accusation that many observers saw as politically motivated. Within days, Chadema was accused of failing to comply with new electoral guidelines that required all parties to sign a code of conduct by mid-April. When the party refused, citing concerns over fairness and government interference, the Electoral Commission swiftly disqualified it from participating in the October election. In one stroke, Lissu and his party, the largest opposition force in the country, were effectively erased from the presidential race. The news sent shockwaves through the nation. Many Tanzanians, particularly the youth who had rallied behind Lissu's message of justice and accountability, felt silenced. Protests flared briefly, but police responded with force, and opposition gatherings were swiftly banned. Human rights groups warned that the exclusion of Chadema would leave voters without a genuine choice, but the government stood firm. For the ruling party, the removal of Lissu removed the only figure capable of mounting a serious challenge to President Samia Suluhu Hassan's bid for re-election. As if that weren't enough to damage the credibility of the election, another major blow came just weeks later. Luhaga Jolson Paina, the presidential candidate for ACT Wazalendo, Tanzania's second-largest opposition party, found himself entangled in a bureaucratic and legal battle that ended in his disqualification. Initially nominated by his party amid high hopes, Paina's candidacy was challenged by the Attorney General, who claimed that the nomination process had violated internal party rules. On September 15, 2025, the Independent National Electoral Commission upheld the objection, striking Paina's name from the official ballot. His supporters were outraged, calling the move a state-engineered technicality. For a brief moment, the High Court intervened and reinstated him, giving his campaign a flicker of hope. But just days later, the Electoral Commission reversed the ruling and permanently barred him. This time, the decision was final. The removal of both Lissu and Paina within a span of months effectively cleared the field for the ruling CCM candidate, President Samia Suluhu Hassan, to secure an easy path to victory. The once vibrant political arena was now eerily quiet. The opposition had been stripped of its key contenders, and the few minor candidates who remained lacked the influence or resources to mount a serious campaign. In Dar es Salaam and Arusha, whispers spread through the streets that the election was not truly an election at all but a coronation. Citizens expressed frustration and disbelief that two of the most prominent voices for change had been silenced before ballots were even cast. Civil society groups, journalists, and international observers warned that the credibility of the vote was in jeopardy. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch both released statements condemning what they described as a systematic effort to suppress competition and stifle dissent. Meanwhile, the government maintained that the disqualifications were purely procedural. Officials argued that both parties had violated electoral regulations and that the commission had simply followed the law. But for many Tanzanians, the pattern was all too familiar, reminiscent of the days of former President John Pombe Magufuli, whose government ruled with an iron fist and left little room for opposition voices. As the election approached, the streets grew tense. Chadema supporters were harassed, ACT Wazalendo offices were raided, and several activists disappeared under mysterious circumstances. On Election Day, October 29, 2025, protests erupted in major cities. Police fired tear gas into crowds demanding a fair vote, and reports of live bullets being used began to circulate. Soon after, the government imposed a curfew, and internet access across the country was shut down. For many Tanzanians, the removal of Lissu and Paina symbolized more than political maneuvering, it represented the erosion of democracy itself. With the most credible opposition figures silenced, the people's hope for a genuine contest faded. The ruling party's victory, though certain, came at a heavy price: the trust of its citizens and the respect of the international community. Across East Africa, the developments in Tanzania stirred concern. Neighboring nations watched closely, knowing that instability in such a pivotal country could ripple across borders. Tanzania's ports and transport corridors are vital to regional trade, and any disruption could have economic consequences for the entire bloc. But beyond trade, the fear was deeper, that the weakening of democracy in Tanzania might embolden other governments in the region to follow the same path. In the end, as the dust settled and results were announced, many Tanzanians were left to wonder what had become of the democratic ideals their nation once stood for. The removal of opposition candidates had not just changed the course of an election, it had altered the nation's political soul. In the restless streets of Dar es Salaam, the pulse of Tanzania's youth beats louder than ever. What began as a quiet sense of frustration has now exploded into open defiance, as thousands of young men and women, many of them first-time voters, find themselves at the center of a political storm that has swept across the nation. The 2025 election, once heralded as a chance for Tanzania's new generation to shape their future, has instead become a stage of anger, fear, and disillusionment. With opposition leaders disqualified and the ruling party tightening its grip, young Tanzanians have taken to the streets to express what words alone could not contain. By the final week of October, Dar es Salaam had transformed into a city of tension. Crowds of young people gathered at junctions, waving placards and chanting, "Hatutaki CCM." "We don't want CCM." Others shouted, "Tunataka haki." "We want justice." Their voices echoed off the walls of buses and buildings as they demanded a fair vote and the return of democracy they felt had been stolen from them. In neighborhoods like Kimera, Ubungo, and Kinondoni, small groups of youth blocked roads with stones and burning tires. The air filled with smoke and chants, the smell of tear gas soon followed. Police in riot gear fired warning shots into the air, dispersing crowds that quickly regrouped elsewhere. It was a dangerous dance between courage and fear, one that played out across the country's major towns, from Mwanza to Arusha and Dodoma. Many of these young people were born long after Tanzania's one-party era, but they had grown up hearing stories of oppression under past regimes. For them, the current crackdown felt like history repeating itself. Their frustration wasn't only about the election, it was about the life they faced every day: high unemployment, rising costs of living, and the feeling that political leaders no longer cared about their generation's hopes. Some used their phones to live-stream protests, coordinating through encrypted messaging apps. But even this became difficult as the government imposed widespread internet restrictions. Videos stopped loading, messages wouldn't send, and suddenly, silence fell over digital spaces that had once been filled with defiance. "They can block the internet," one young protester said before disappearing into the crowd, "but they can't block our voices." As violence spread, the government moved swiftly. On the night of October 29th, the Ministry of Home Affairs announced a curfew across Dar es Salaam. From 6 p.m. onward, no one was allowed on the streets except security forces and authorized personnel. The curfew was to last until further notice, effectively turning the country's largest city into a ghost town after sunset. Shops closed early, buses stopped running, and an eerie quiet replaced the usual hum of the night. But for many youth, the silence was not peace, it was the calm of fear. Some young men were reportedly arrested for defying the curfew, while others were beaten for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. In the poorer neighborhoods, parents barred their children from leaving home, afraid they would vanish like others who had been taken away in the chaos. The government defended the curfew as a necessary step to protect property and restore order, but to the youth, it was proof that their voices were being smothered. They saw it as the latest in a series of moves designed to keep them quiet. Civil servants were told to work from home, schools were closed, and private businesses urged to stay shut until calm returned. Yet even under curfew, the young refused to give up. Small groups began meeting secretly, some in church halls, others in abandoned warehouses, to plan their next moves. They spoke of a future beyond this election, a Tanzania that could rise again if only the youth stayed united. "They fear us because we are many," one university student whispered to a friend. "We are the future they can't control." Outside Tanzania, the world watched in silence. International observers condemned the violence and urged restraint, but few dared to intervene. Neighboring countries, worried about unrest spreading across borders, tightened security and called for calm. Yet beneath the surface, many East Africans saw a reflection of their own struggles, young people demanding freedom in systems that often failed to hear them. By the end of October, Tanzania was on edge. The streets may have quieted under the weight of the curfew, but the anger had not disappeared. It lived in the hearts of millions of young people who felt betrayed by their leaders and unseen by their country. For them, this election had become more than a political contest. It was a test of their generation's resolve. In whispered conversations and defiant glances, the youth of Tanzania made a silent promise that no matter how many curfews or bans came their way, they would keep fighting for a nation where their voices mattered. The night may have belonged to fear, but the morning, they believed, would belong to them.